because as a photographer, rather than going out in the world and taking pictures, I am interested in making pictures inside a studio space. Here I just have a white wall and the gray floor, and I was using my view camera, which is over there, and looking and seeing how the space looked when I looked through the camera. And on the camera, on the viewfinder, there is a grid that helps you see where things are located within that two-dimensional frame. So I'm using tape to put down these lines of grid, and it looks like this, but then when you look through the camera, then it appears flat. I am very much interested in how three-dimensional space can look when you look through the camera. I am interested in the history of how the camera came about. A lot of the things that we take for granted are based on certain decisions that were made in the past. And so I feel that how we see through the camera has more to do with how we want to see the world, in a way, like how we desire to see the world in this organized format. Which may not have much to do with how the real world may seem, but it's still an interesting place to visit because it speaks about perhaps our desires and longings for having certain kinds of visual experience. Yeah, so light became, I guess, another material that became very important. Because for a while I had a studio space that didn't have any windows, and I really wanted to start working with light as a material that delineates and articulates how the space looks. So that became very much important, and how that can play with certain kinds of geometry, because living or working in this kind of industrial building, we have rectangular windows, so even when the light comes in, then it will create these kinds of geometric shapes, and also playing off with that. I guess that's why I have a lot of rectangles as a form to work with in my photographs. And also, I guess light as like a fourth dimensional thing, because it kind of locates like certain time and certain season. Sometimes I make this setup and I take a lot of photographs to see what I'm really interested in, and it's always kind of amazing to see how there are so many different shots from different time points. So then, yeah, time and light definitely becomes part of the material.
I guess the main thing about my work that has always been the case is, as I've changed over the years, is observation. So everything's about looking, and for a lot of years it was looking at landscapes. I was painting outside, studying light, atmosphere, form, all these things. And for many, many years, that was my practice. And what happened is it started to get repetitive. The landscape can look like a few different ways, and it's always like ground on the bottom, sky on the top, objects in the picture plane. So I was just done with it. But I always had observed, and that was what I sort of enjoyed about painting, was looking. So I wanted to sort of come up with a studio practice that was about looking, but it wasn't like still life painting, which is sort of the same thing as landscape painting. So I started painting. I was kind of interested in objects that maybe sort of disguise their own form or aren't obvious or confusing instead of so straightforward, because landscape painting is about being explicit and explaining everything and showing exactly what's going on, and I wanted to paint things that were a little more ambiguous. And I've started to enjoy being in that space where people are like, I think I know what that is, or about 50% of people will know, and then the rest will be like, what is that? It's too weird to be made up, but I have no idea what it is. So I started getting into these holographic films because, like, by their very nature and their structure, the way they interact with light, it creates artificial space. So it's like this weird, like cyberspace or something. It's a bizarre optical phenomenon, and I got really interested in it because it was about light, and it was a type of light and space that I'd never painted before. So it was a kind of a new thing, and what it ended up being is extremely technical type of observation, because I'm standing in front of this material, and if you'd have to be in exactly the same orientation to it every time in order to paint the same pattern. So it became this exercise in like precision. I'd have to wear the same shoes. I'd have to have exactly the same lights. I never touched the object because I didn't want it to ever move at all. And this is an example right here. So this is like a holographic film. And if I wanted to paint like this exact square, this one is easy because it's in this sort of bright section, so I could find it pretty simply. But if I wanted to paint, like this exact square, I'd have to probably count over from this bright spot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then count down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I would find that square and see what was going on, all the while like not moving at all, and then paint it. And it's very like, I thought it was quite meditative. Other people think it's insane or obsessive, and it is. I still find that observation to be a place that I just like to be in all the time. I just want to like live in these weird little light squares.
So I grew up in Northern California along the coastline, and there are areas of that coastline that had dangerous elements. There's the whole Lost Coast, which is almost, you can't get to it without walking or hiking in. And then there's parts of the coastline that are very jagged, lots of rocks. So I think that my relationship to nature definitely has changed since living in these urban environments. Brooklyn, and I lived in Oakland, California, and San Francisco, and other places not far from natural settings, but definitely more industrial. And so what I find is that oftentimes I'm longing for it, and I'm longing for that connection and that feeling of the visual satisfaction of seeing so many textures and colors and reflections, and sort of the depth of the visual experience of being in nature. So I think there's part of me that when I come to the studio, I'm looking for those reflective surfaces. Sometimes I paint something and I'm like, oh, that's like a wave. I miss the ocean. Or I mix a kind of a green that's like mossy, and it's almost like my body's craving it. And then I think those things come into the imagery, but again, it's not necessarily conscious. It's maybe after the fact that I look at the imagery and that I see in the work, and that's what surfaces. When I'm working, I'm thinking of an idea for the way that color can be combined, or the way that something two-dimensional could kind of change into being three-dimensional. I would talk about them as experiments, and sort of trying to construct meaning from fragments. So with the collage work, I start with an idea, and then part of the process is deconstructing the idea and then reassembling it. And there's a lot of risk involved in a way because you're destroying things and at the same time that you're building them up. But in that risk, there's also a lot of freedom. So that's exciting to me because I'm often surprised by the way something looks when it's put together in a new way. But then there's also, I'm noticing, a little bit of an element of an edge or maybe something that wouldn't be safe. So, you know, the edges may be sharp or the pieces may look broken at the same time as they're kind of reassembled or glued back together.
The idea behind this work is that I'm describing this in-between place, really something that's internal for me. And it was important for me to make work that had a sense of wonderment about it. So really, when you look into these pieces, they're meant to read as these fantastical landscapes. And really, I don't want the viewer to be able to see themselves too much in it, to really emphasize this idea of an abstract space and something that's internal and spiritual. And material-wise, I find mirror very interesting because historically people thought of it as, you know, a way that you could see the reflection of the soul. It can also be thought of as a portal or a window into another world. And essentially, when you look into these pieces, you know, there's the illusion of this other universe, this other landscape that exists beyond the walls. So this work is normally mounted on the wall and is somewhat of a riff on traditional landscape painting. My intention is really to create something that's a bit more dynamic than what I think of as landscape painting. So as the viewer moves around this work, depending on their vantage point, they have a completely different perspective from moment to moment. I like that. So material-wise, there's a long history with the mirror being of a spiritual association, and there are stories of royalty in the late 1700s selling off an entire parcel of land just to purchase one mirror because they were thought of as so exceptionally special and spiritual and unique and divine. Really, mirrors associated and reflective surfaces are associated with the divine and have been thought of as portals to other universes, and were also used as a source of divining the future, for instance. And I also like that it has the paradox that it's from the earth, it's made from sand, but then it's also a man-made material, and even though it has all of these spiritual associations, you often find it cladding the outside of skyscrapers, something you don't think of as being spiritual. And I wanted to use glass mirror rather than plexi because it's important to me that the materials I use have a lot of contrast in them. For instance, I kind of think to use a reflective plexi is almost too warm. I like the coldness of the glass and architectural associations that you have with that. And just like the light that I use, you know, of course, light that's an easy go-to for spirituality, you know. But it's also, I'm also choosing a temperature of light that's on the cooler side, and it's what you see in the subway, it's what you see in industrial spaces. So there's that association. And then as far as the drawings go that I'm using, I tend to gravitate towards more organic imagery so that there's this back and forth play between the materials, and it's not that one material belongs in one world or the other. It's really sort of this back and forth conversation between the combination of things and sort of the relationship of those. So what appeals to me in a drawing, or when I, know that it's something that I'd like to use, is when it really approaches this status of itness, where you're not really certain what it's made of or what it's depicting exactly, if you're seeing something that's coming into formation or if it's disintegrating. One of the materials that I'm really fond of using is liquid graphite, and I like working with that material because it has a very mineral-like quality, and it's very fluid, and I tend to work with it in a manner that allows it to just do its own thing. And I haven't used a brush in probably 3 years. I use my hands a lot to make the work. Oftentimes I'm placing the pigment, the material on glass, and combining it with water and manipulating it with the paper with face down, so I'm not really letting myself have so much control over the material. And really, I just want these things to belong unto themselves. I want them to really just be their own things, their own objects, and I like the idea of the viewer being uncertain about whether they're looking at an artifact from 100 years ago or something that you might find in a space opera, or that you may see in the future at some point.
And so materials that I've used historically have been things like zippers or industrial spools of thread, found objects, raw hook and eye extenders, anything that runs the gamut. So initially I'm sort of inspired by things that are maybe just overlooked or maybe non-important. Castaways, the zippers I should say, I found in a dumpster outside of a warehouse in Long Island City, and they were shutting down the factory, and so I just took what I could manage, and I live with my materials maybe 15 years sometimes before they become something. And so there is this kind of there's this kind of period of gestation and familiarity that has to happen between me and the actual material, but I think that the process actually completes for me the space between the artist's hand, my hand, and the material that I'm using. And the intention sort of behind the process really makes it come full circle. Ceramics has been a really key kind of factor into the exploration of space in my life, personally, physical space, like here in my studio, personal, emotional, all sorts of space. I've been thinking a lot about the concept of space and allowing more space in. And so I think ceramics, I've done in the past, I've done ceramics since undergraduate work, but going back to the medium kind of on a regular basis really has been pushing the fluidity transition between different media, and informing different processes for me, such as the cutouts. I'm going to envision sort of doing partial cutouts in the circles behind me, and have been doing a lot of cutting into clay slabs that I hand throw. So for me, I want to talk a little bit about materials. So when Melissa asked me to sort of talk about my process and how it relates potentially to spirituality and materials, I began thinking historically about the types of materials I used and use, and what attracts me to them. And the materials I use are common, predominantly everyday materials. They can reference do-it-yourself kind of techniques, or they can reference definitely handmade traditions, such as quilting or sewing or knitting. We had this experience of an honor, I would say, of stretching a goat hide And again, that I went to that workshop with the intention to create more space and see the concept of the space. And that's what you literally had to do for hours, is pull the goat hide with a partner, and it became like this kind of poetic dance and movement, and something was actually happening. It was softening the hide and stretching. And so I think about, I read this quote somewhere, and I can't remember where it was, but it's moving me. It's, she carries the void. And I've been thinking a lot about that in relation to having children and in relation to making work and creating space, and what that void is kind of in a larger sense of the world.